Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program. Today, it is 1 week since we lost our beloved David Lehrer. Thank you for your gorgeous notes and the outpouring of love from this community. All of your notes are shared with just one moment. All of your notes are shared with David's family, and they too are comforted by your sentiments. We are still in the week of Shiva, and we dedicate tonight's program to David's incredible life and his memory. On behalf of our leadership team, Zev, Mel, Rabbi Chasen, and Caroline, I welcome tonight's guest, David Leonhardt, as well as our outstanding moderator, Warren Olney. With the war in Israel and Gaza now in its third week, our team decided to present our third Israel in Crisis briefing in as many weeks. This will be number 3 in 3 weeks. We have asked former Ambassador Dennis Ross, who is currently in the Middle East, to brief us next Tuesday upon his return. As most of you know, Ambassador Ross spent many years as the chief U.S. negotiator and special envoy to the Middle East, having served 4 U.S. presidents in that capacity. He is one of the people most knowledgeable and with the greatest understanding of the issues confronting the Middle East. His analysis and thoughts will be especially valuable next week, as he will have just returned from the region. You can sign up in the email you will receive right after tonight's program. That program is on Tuesday, next Tuesday, November 7th at 5 p.m. Pacific. And on Wednesday, November 8th, we will welcome 2 scholars who specialize in issues of democracy and autocracy. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a history professor at NYU who specializes in fascism and autocracies. She will be in conversation with Larry Diamond of Stanford's Freeman Spogli School for International Studies, who is a foremost scholar in the field of democracy studies. This will be an exceptional hour with 2 renowned scholars. That's next Wednesday at 5. I hope you are all doing well with our new Zoom-based registration system. If you have trouble registering on your iPad, use your phone or computer, and when all else fails, you can email me and I'll help you to the extent that I can. You must be registered to receive the Zoom link, which comes directly from Zoom, as you have all figured out by now. Now to turn to tonight's program. Warren Olney is well known to this audience. He has decades of experience as a broadcast journalist. He was host and executive producer of the nationally syndicated public radio program To the Point, as well as the Southern California popular local public affairs program, Which Way LA, which ran for years and years on LA's NPR affiliate, KCRW. Warren has received many awards for his excellence. He was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Radio and Television News Association of Southern California, and is the only 2-time winner of the LA Society of Professional Journalists Distinguished Journalist Award. It is now my honor to hand the program over to Warren, who will introduce and engage with tonight's guest. Warren?
Thank you very much, Janice. I appreciate that. And of course, this program has been dedicated to the memory of David Lehrer. How could it be otherwise? He was so important to America at a Crossroads. I'm just going to take a moment of personal privilege here to express the fact that his loss is a great loss for me, and it's a great loss for all of Los Angeles. That when I was a reporter, I used to cover him, and from a distance, when he was in the ADL, and then when he established Community Partners, and then Jews United for Democracy and Justice, I always admired the fact that he was trying to bring Los Angeles together, and knowing, of course, at all times that is an impossible task and one that will never end. And nonetheless, he worked on it energetically and I think successfully in many cases, won a lot of battles, and we are all better for the fact that he waged them. From a personal standpoint, I would say this about him. I got to know him working on this program, and what I found was that I have been his friend all along. I never knew that. And I think everybody must have had that relationship with David Lehrer, because the moment you got together with him, all of a sudden he was available. He was your friend. He was open. He was available. He was wise. He was kind. And we would have these long conversations. We'd end up talking about things that were personal, things that were political, things that were philosophical, and there seemed to be no end to it. I'm going to miss him. He also told a lot of jokes, and he was a funny guy as well. His funeral, which I was privileged to attend, was a very moving event, and it was an overflow event, suggesting the number of people that he has touched in this community who were willing to show up at that and wanted to show up. it also illustrated for me that one of the major points of his legacy is going to be his family. He has children and grandchildren who are already, in some cases, beyond their years, eloquent and wise. And like David, I think they make the world better just for being in it. That doesn't make up for the loss that we have all suffered. They have suffered, of course, more than the rest of us have. But it is a kind of compensation, and I want to thank them all for that, for being who they are. They are a tribute to David Lerer. Now it's time for me to introduce David Leonhardt. Before I get, David, to the biography and the background and all that, I know you have something to say about David Lerer.
Yeah, very briefly, I just wanted to say that he and Janice created something important with this conversation series. They created something that has delivered many hours of joy and enlightenment to thousands of people. It's a profound accomplishment among David's many others. And I know that he specifically believed deeply in the idea of respectful debate and discussion and disagreement even. And he believed in the idea of grappling with all of the evidence out there, even when it's inconvenient to your views. And I just think that's so important. And Warren, you and I'll try to live up to that standard in our discussion tonight. And it's an incredible honor to be part of a program that is in his honor.
Well, it is for me as well, and it's an honor to have you. So thank you very much. David Leonhardt, folks, and I want to incidentally say hello to the audience and remind you as well that you'll be able to ask questions. You can send them to Janice. I think you know how to do that. She will then forward them to me, as David used to do in the old days, last week and the week before, or not last week, but prior weeks. And I will begin asking those a bit later in the program as we go along. David Leonhardt is a senior writer at the New York Times. He writes the daily newsletter called The Morning. He has been the paper's Washington bureau chief, an op-ed columnist, a staff writer for Times Magazine. He was a founding editor of The Upshot. He is a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. His first book has just been published. It's called Ours Was a Shining Future: What's Happened to the American Dream. And David, welcome back, I should say, to America at a Crossroads. Great to have you.
Thank you, Warren.
I, of course, want to talk about your book, and I think a lot of people want to hear about it as well. But I also have to ask you about some of the daily news that you're covering.
Of course.
On The Morning, and most obviously the war between Israel and Hamas. And let me begin with this. President Biden first gave his full backing to Israel after October 7th. Does he now, do you think, appear to be pulling back a bit?
I think he's pulling back a bit, but I think it may be more tactical than that he is supporting Israel less than he was before. I think there are a couple different questions here. President Biden was extremely eloquent in condemning the Hamas attacks as what they were, which was just absolutely brutal terrorism. They involved the murder of hundreds of innocent civilians, more than 1,000 people, 1,400 people in all. In many cases, Hamas videotaped the killing. They taunted their victims. They wanted to turn it into propaganda. It's truly horrific. And President Biden condemned that in a way that a lot of other people did not condemn it. And I don't think there's any softening of President Biden's basic support for the idea that any country that was attacked the way that Israel was would respond. Having said that, I think it's unclear what is the response from Israel that will actually be the most effective politically. And it's also important to say that Israel doesn't need to just think about what to do to destroy Hamas. They need to take into account civilian lives in Gaza. This is a really difficult situation. In many cases, there are trade-offs between protecting civilian lives and a military success, in part because Hamas hides its weapons in mosques and hospitals and under schools and places like that. So it's a phenomenally difficult situation. I think part of what you see from President Biden is an acknowledgement that it's not clear exactly what is the approach here that is actually most in Israel's interest. And it's not necessarily absolutely maximum force in a situation that would cause Israel to lose international support. And I think if the history of the last couple decades shows anything, it's that urban warfare is phenomenally difficult. And, President Biden said basically, look, don't repeat our mistakes. After 9/11, we were so enraged. We followed a strategy that felt very good emotionally and really weakened the United States. And so I think that's mostly what you see from the White House. It's mostly asking Israel to be smart about its own interests.
There's certainly no way to exaggerate the horror of what happened on October 7th. And I understand that everybody needs to denounce it. Since the bombing began, though, it is now estimated that some 8,000 Palestinians have been killed. And I think that number is generally accepted, even though it originated to some extent with the Palestinian Authority, which is, with Hamas and their public health organization. But that's led to enormous opposition in this country and to a lot of anti-Semitism as well. But does the opposition in this country, do you think, not just on college campuses, but elsewhere, make the change on President Biden's part politically tactical as well as internationally tactical? I mean, here in this country, he's running for re-election.
He is. And I think that's a fair point. Politics, I mean, if you're trying to figure out what a president's doing, usually politics play a role. So my guess is politics do play a role. And there was a Gallup poll that showed President Biden's approval among Democrats dropping. It's not exactly clear why, but the timing certainly lines up with the war. I do think it's important to kind of think about public opinion in all its nuance here. I mean, you have 100 senators signing on to support for Israel. You have the vast majority of the House of Representatives signing on to support for Israel to defend itself. It is true that we now see a very much of a schism on the left in this country among Democrats. And it's true that the institutions that first of all, just from a polling perspective, most Jewish voters are on the left. So this is, I think, particularly difficult and painful for many Jewish voters. There are Jewish voters on both sides of this schism. It's also the case that if you think about university campuses and you think about the entertainment industry and you think about the media, these are places that both have an outsized place in the national discussion, and they are places that don't tend to just be filled with people on the Democratic half of the spectrum, but the left part of the Democratic spectrum. This is not unique to the Israel issue. We saw it during COVID, when actually most Americans were ready to restart life more quickly. But you saw a lot of discussions from people who consider themselves very liberal about extended lockdowns. This is a similar version of it. And so while there certainly is a divide, I think it's important to say that most of the divide is within the left, as opposed to being a society-wide divide. If you look at most measures of things society-wide, Israel continues to have really significant support from Americans and from American political leaders. Long term, I think the divide on the left is a huge problem for Israel. And I think it's really a reason for Israel to be reflective about the ways in which the policies that it has pursued in the 21st century have been losing it some of its traditional friends.
The United Nations is advocating a ceasefire or for humanitarian reasons. Prime Minister Netanyahu says that would be a victory for Hamas. He says there's absolutely no way that Israel is going to allow that. Secretary of State Blinken is headed back to the region. What do you think his mission is?
I don't know what his particular mission is. I think the issue with the ceasefire is when I hear people call for a ceasefire, what I want to know is, okay, and what is their strategy for preventing Hamas from being able to do this again? Because the notion that a country that was attacked the way that Israel was on October 7th would respond with a ceasefire is deeply unusual, right? The United States did not respond to Pearl Harbor with a ceasefire. The United States did not respond to 9/11 with a ceasefire. Now, as I've already covered, sometimes a country can respond in ways that undermine its own interests. I mean, I think the United States is substantially weaker in the world today because of the way it responded to 9/11. So that doesn't call for maximum response. And as I said, it is vital that there be weight put on Palestinian lives as part of this calculation. But when I hear people call for a ceasefire, to me, it always begs a question of, do they just think Hamas should be allowed to remain in control of Gaza and potentially launch another attack like this? Because usually when one party attacks another, a ceasefire is indeed to the benefit of the party that attacked it.
On the other hand, how else will we get the hostages out? People want to know.
Well, I don't know. And obviously that's an extremely important issue, right? 4 hostages, I believe, have been released as part of negotiations.
Right.
1 has been rescued by the Israeli military. All those are factors that probably explain why this. I know the Israeli government doesn't like to call it a ground invasion, but I think I like the English language. I think to call it a modest invasion is a perfectly good use of the English language. That's obviously part of it. It's not clear to me, though, that a ceasefire brings the hostages home. I mean, I think this is just such a miserable situation for so many of the people involved, because it really isn't clear what the best approach is here to have a situation where you do not have an empowered Hamas able to conduct terrorist attacks on Israel. And quite frankly, a Hamas that was not doing very much to lift the living standards of Gazans. It was much more focused on weapons than on schools and people's health and things like that. And I think it's just really hard to know what the right solution here is. And it's hard not to expect and fear that things are going to get worse before they get better.
You have written at length about the tunnels and how, by virtue of the way they use the tunnels, Hamas is responsible in many ways for the deaths of Palestinians, because they are effectively sheltered or hiding behind, if you will, the Palestinian civilians.
Yes. I mean, look, it is part of Hamas's strategy to hide its fighters in the civilian population, try to make them look like civilians, to hide its weapons among the civilian population, and thus so that for Israel to attack it, Israel has to kill civilians. That is part of Hamas's strategy. Israel is absolutely right to point that out. It's vital to say. What I would say is that Israel should, it's a little bit of a repeat because I said a bit of it before. I really think Israel and the Israeli government and the Netanyahu government needs to reflect on the ways that its policies have lost its friends around the world and really have led to incredible schisms and dysfunction within Israel. I mean, the Netanyahu government really has expanded settlements in ways that make a long-term solution here that would protect Israel's peace and security less likely. The Netanyahu government has done things that have lost its allies, and the kind of notion that in the long term that the way this is going to work is that either of these two sides are going to drive the other off of this land strikes me as deeply damaging. And there really are ways in which the Netanyahu government has pursued a policy that has included really the idea of driving Palestinians off parts of the land. And long term, I just don't see how that creates peace for Israel.
President Biden wants a single piece of legislation for both Israel and Ukraine. The new speaker, Mike Johnson, already has said he wants to separate them. I think he's generated a bill to do that. Where's that going, do you think? And how difficult is it going to make it to get money for either Israel or Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, this is a reminder of just how conservative the new Speaker of the House is. I mean, the coup that Matt Gaetz conducted in the House to get rid of Kevin McCarthy worked. I mean, they got someone in the Speaker's role who is just extremely, extremely conservative. And he has proposed a bill that separates the aid to Israel from the aid both to Ukraine and to Taiwan. And not only that, but in a way that emergency military aid isn't normally the case. He said that the government needs to pay for that aid by reducing spending on IRS enforcement agents. Now, the Congressional Budget Office came out and said that actually that might not save money, it might cost money, because those IRS agents essentially, well, their job is to make sure that rich people aren't avoiding their taxes, which they more than pay for themselves in the American government. But this isn't necessarily going to become law. The Ukraine and Taiwan have enormous support among Senate Republicans. This is going to need to be a negotiation among President Biden, the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, and then the new Speaker of the House and the Republican caucus in the House. So I'm not saying this is going to become law. It almost certainly won't. But I do find it really quite striking that the Republican Party is the party that embraces the idea of patriotism. In fact, I think one of the errors that people on the left have made, I talk about this in my book, is a sort of disdain for certain aspects of patriotism. I mean, if you ask Americans, is the United States the greatest country in the world? Democrats who have four-year college degrees, most of them do not answer that question yes. Every other subgroup of Americans by education and party does say yes. And so the Republicans are supposed to be the party that embrace patriotism, and to give them some credit. In fact, Republican voters do embrace patriotism more than Democratic voters. And yet, for the Republicans to turn their back on Ukraine when Russia, who is an obvious stated enemy of the United States, went into Ukraine and tried to take it over and expand authoritarianism and crush democracy, and China is threatening to do the same thing in Taiwan. I mean, some people criticize President Biden for talking about the world as being in a struggle between democracy and autocracy because it's a little bit too simplistic. But it's only a little bit too simplistic. Taiwan is a democracy, China is not. Ukraine is a democracy, Russia is not. And Israel is a democracy, and Hamas does not believe in democracy. They have not held elections since winning the first ones that they were involved in. They've basically run an authoritarian semi-government since then. And so you see Russia welcoming Hamas, Russian leaders welcoming Hamas. You see China producing a map that has erased Israel. I mean, it seems quite clear here that the United States and Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel, for all of the problems of the current Israeli government, share some basic interests. And it's really quite striking to see the most senior Republican in Washington, unless you count Chief Justice John Roberts, basically say, we actually don't want to help our allies, Ukraine and Taiwan. I think it's a political stunt, but sometimes political stunts have real world effects.
I would like to ask you more about current events because they are so challenging and so fascinating, but I also want to talk to you about the book. So let's do that. You just made a reference to it, and it was an interesting one, I thought. The book, once again, is called Ours Was a Shining Future, The Rise and Fall of the American Dream. And of course, the first thing to ask, it seems to me, is how do you define the American dream? What the hell is that?
Yeah. And actually, there's a fun little backstory there. Warren, I see it next to you there. You have an advanced copy of the book, a galley.
I do.
And at the last minute, actually, after the galleys came out, we changed the subtitle. So the version you have on your desk does, in fact, say The Rise and Fall of the American Dream. We changed it to The Story of the American Dream because I didn't want to suggest that the fall was final. And we can circle back to that at the end, some reasons for optimism, which I know was a David Lehrer favorite thing to do at the end of conversation. So the definition of the American dream is really fascinating. I call this book a biography of the American dream at one point, and I think of it in some ways like a biography of a famous person whose name you know, but maybe you don't really know their true backstory. And that's what I've tried to do in part in this book with the American Dream. And the first thing to know about the American Dream is, even if people now often use it ironically or say it's dead or say it doesn't exist, it was invented in a completely earnest way. And it was invented during the Great Depression, which is truly amazing. Before 1931, if you do a search in newspapers, which was one of the great joys of writing this book, going back and spending time living.
History is fascinating.
It's just thank you. And feeling like you're living in earlier eras, which you really do when you read these old newspapers, because not only are you stumbling on the articles that you went to look for, but I'm a sports fan, so I'd go check out the baseball scores from the 1930s. One of the really striking things is just the extent to which normal life continued for Americans who were not at war during World War II. All the normal things were going on. Yeah. In any event, before 1931, you will sometimes stumble on the words American and dream being next to each other in newspapers, but they're almost accidental uses. It's not the use we know today. And the phrase as we know it today was coined by a historian named James Truslow Adams in a 1931 book. And he described the American dream, or as he said, that American dream, as the United States' most important contribution to the world. And he said it was that dream of a better, richer, happier life for all our citizens of every rank. And I think it's a lovely definition. It embodies the idea of progress. He says better, richer, happier, right? Things are getting better for you over your life or for your children relative to you. And it embodies the idea of social mobility. He says it's a dream for all our citizens of every rank. And for all of the challenges to the dream in 1931, he acknowledges we were in a depression. And for all of the challenges to the dream today, it has remained an incredibly powerful idea. I mean, Martin Luther King's speech is, "I have a dream." It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. That's the most famous protest speech in American history. And its signature image is based on the American dream. And I mentioned China before. When Xi Jinping takes over China as the president and the head of the Chinese Communist Party, one of his great visions, he says, is a Chinese dream, which is obviously riffing off the American dream. So this idea that James Trousseau Adams invented during the Great Depression has really endured. And in that way, I think it's a reasonable yardstick for us to still hold ourselves up to and say, how well are we doing?
It seems to me you refine it down, and instead of just saying better, richer, happier for everybody, you say that every generation supposedly will be richer than their parents were, and that's the standard. That's how you measure how the American dream is going.
Yes, I would say better living standards than our parents, but as anyone who's ever lacked money knows, it's really hard to have good living standards without money. So yes, one of the things that I talk about in the book is several years ago, there was a team of economists, more than a decade ago now, who got access to tax records, millions of tax records, that really allowed them to study economic mobility in a way that no one ever had before. Before they got the access to these records, economists had to do studies where they would maybe create a panel of 2,000 Americans, and they'd go interview them, and then they'd go interview those same Americans a few years later, but some of them had moved or decided they didn't want to be part of the survey anymore. And it's just really, really hard to figure out how often people escaped poverty over the course of their lives, or what someone's children's life were relative to them. This idea of longitudinal research. But these economists at Harvard and Brown and elsewhere, they got access to these tax records, which were just amazing. Why they didn't have anybody's name. They could follow anonymous people from one year to the next and their kids, and they tied them to census records. And I went to them and I said, this is amazing work you've done, but your statistics are a little bit hard for those of us who aren't academic economists to follow. Am I right to think that you can actually use your data to create an index of the American dream? Could you use your data to tell us what percentage of Americans grow up to make more money than their parents made at the same age? And I couldn't have done this. I'm not a research economist. And they said, wow, maybe that would be hard, but these are really creative economists. The head of this team is named Raj Chetty at Harvard, and they figured out how to do it. And what they discovered is that Americans born in 1940, 92% of them grew up to make more money than their parents. That's a virtual guarantee. I mean, a lot of those 92% were laid off at some point or had a real health problem. A lot of those 92% were not white male Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who obviously were a very privileged class in 1940. And yet 92% of Americans born that year grew up to do better than their parents. And you fast forward to now and millennials, and the odds have gone down from 92% to about 50-50. And so the odds of achieving what I would argue is the most basic definition of the American dream have gone from a virtual guarantee to a coin flip.
So you then trace the rise and fall of the American dream as you have defined it. So what are the principal things that caused it to rise?
I think one of the most important, and I'm happy to talk about the others, I cite three main factors. I think the most important is political power. And I think that the main way that Americans built political power in the 1930s and 40s that led to this era in which we created the largest middle class in history were labor unions. And look, I've been in a labor union. I know they're imperfect. I've been frustrated by how difficult it was to navigate the health benefits of my labor union when one of my young children had a medical emergency. I've been a manager at the New York Times who's managed alongside the labor union, and I've sometimes been frustrated about its reticence to change. We are in an industry, as you know, Warren, that has had to change very rapidly. And so I am well aware of the flaws of labor unions. But the way I think about it is corporations are flawed too. And if we end up in a world in which flawed corporations are not checked by flawed labor unions, we end up with the economy that we've had, which is one with remarkably rising inequality. When labor unions were growing and strong from the 30s through the 60s, middle income and lower income people got larger percentage raises than upper income people. I include a chart in the book in which we put on the same chart the percentage of Americans in labor unions and the percentage of income going to the bottom 50% of earners. And they're like a mirror image of each other. When one goes up, the other, so it's the bottom 50%. So when one goes up, the other goes up. It's just really remarkable. And we've basically had this economy with shrinking labor unions and massively rising inequality. And look, this week, obviously, we started by talking about the news. This week, we saw another example of the power of labor unions. Ford and Chrysler and GM would not have given workers raises that helped them catch up to the huge concessions they had made and helped them catch up to the huge executive pay increases that had happened at those companies if the workers had just asked nicely. If the workers had individually gone to GM and Ford and said, could I please have a raise? The companies would have said no. It was because they were part of a labor union. It was because they had bargaining power. It was because the companies knew that if they went out on strike, it would hurt the companies in a way that one worker quitting a company doesn't. And so I just think that and to be self-critical, I've been an economic journalist for more than 20 years. I don't think I've written enough about labor unions over that time. And in the course of writing this book and really digging into the economic research and then also digging into the history, one of my favorite chapters is the story of A. Philip Randolph and how he built the first Black labor union in this country. I also tell the story of the first important union in Minnesota. We think of Minneapolis today as a liberal city, but actually in the 30s, it was one of the most conservative low-wage cities in the country. It was like a little bit of the South up in the Midwest. Or the Northwest, as they called Minnesota back then. And labor unions really changed all this. And I don't think we're going to get back to an economy with lower inequality without labor unions being a huge part of that story.
Hey, Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, as I remember. Yeah. No sleeping car. They're rare now, so you wouldn't have a union. It would be very big. That your account of that is fascinating. You also have a very interesting account of how some executives, including the father of Mitt Romney, refused to take more than you tell the story. I won't try to.
So if political power is the first thing that I think is important, I think the second is culture. And by culture, I predominantly mean corporate culture. And I don't think that the corporate executives of the 1940s and 50s and 60s were morally superior people to the corporate executives today. But I do think they were operating in a different culture. And I think they behaved less selfishly. And I think they behaved more patriotically. And in ways that put more emphasis on what was good for their community and a little less emphasis only on their own interests. And I like the story of George Romney in this way because George Romney and Mitt Romney have had remarkably similar careers. Both were business executives. Both in their private lives became senior figures in the Mormon Church. Both, after very successful business careers, turned politics as relatively moderate Republicans for their day. Both became governors, George Michigan and Mitt of Massachusetts, and both ran unsuccessfully for the presidency, just remarkably similar. And I have to say, I spent a lot of time researching George Romney for this book, so I looked at a lot of photos of him. And in the middle of that research, I happened to be part of a meeting, not connected to the book, connected to my job at the New York Times, with Mitt Romney. And I've interviewed him a few times over the years, but I hadn't interviewed him in person in, I don't know, maybe a decade. And I almost gasped when he walked in the room, because I'd spent all this time looking at photos of his father with this kind of chiseled look and graying hair at the edges, but still quite youthful. And Mitt walked in the room, and I really thought I was watching George Romney walk off the page of an old Detroit newspaper. And I think whether you agree or disagree with Mitt Romney's politics, I think he's a deeply honorable person. He's willing to buck his party, actually in a way that his dad was as well. He thinks very deeply about what's right. He's deeply conservative. But he also doesn't view Democrats as the enemy. He views them as the opposition party for him. And what strikes me is that George and Mitt were similar in so many ways. George Romney, when he was the CEO of American Motors, as you just alluded to, Warren, the company was doing so well because he introduced the Rambler, which is really one of the first compact cars there was, and Americans decided that they liked
Rambler.
Yeah, liked having a small car, right? And George helped come up with this great advertising line in which he called other cars a dinosaur, which was a great double entendre between suggesting they were out of fashion and talking about how big and unwieldy they were. Yeah. So the company was doing so well under him that he was due a bonus that would have taken his salary above the level that he considered appropriate. He thought it was unseemly for him to make that much more money than any of his workers. And so he went to the board of his company and he said, I know my contract calls for this bonus, but I really think it's inappropriate, and I'd like you to rescind the bonus. Now, let's also say something else. Relative to executives today, if we adjust for inflation, George Romney was making a few $1 million at the time in today's dollars. Nothing compared to what executives make now. And you compare that to Mitt Romney, who I am quite confident when he was making hundreds of millions of dollars at Bain, never once voluntarily returned a bonus. And I think this isn't a statement on George being a better person than Mitt, but I think they were operating in very different cultures. And our corporate culture today, it is self-seeking, it glamorizes enormous wealth. It doesn't put a lot of stock on the idea of building institutions in cities like local theaters or local schools, doesn't put much stock on keeping jobs in a community. And you compare that to the old culture in which executives, they fought unions. They didn't want to give unions big raises, but they didn't try to destroy unions. And they complained about taxes, but they didn't make it their number one political priority to reduce the top marginal tax rate, which was 90% and then 70%. And so I really do think we had a culture among our corporate elite that, as I said, was more patriotic and more communitarian and less selfish. And I think that plays an important role in how we've ended up where we've ended up.
Well, if you've got this rise and fall issue, and you don't want to suggest that it's fallen so far that it's not going to be able to come back up, but is that partly because if you define the American dream in essentially materialistic terms? So that would suggest that if you're going to accomplish the American dream, you're going to accumulate as much stuff as you possibly can.
Well, so I think if you're affluent, it's true that it's accumulate as much stuff as you can. But if you're not affluent, that's not where it starts. If you're not affluent, it starts with, are you able to afford a home in a good school district?
Okay.
If you're not affluent, it's, are you able to afford the best medical care? It's, are you able to afford being able to take vacations and travel across the country, maybe to go see family? And so I really do think money matters. And I think really it's an incredible luxury. You're really only talking about quite affluent people who can say, more money doesn't matter. I think for the vast majority of Americans, the idea of having, thousands of more dollars a year is the difference between having a really decent life and struggling. But I know that money's not everything. And so I really try to avoid making this all about money. I also look at polling data that asks people, how do you feel about the United States? How do you feel about the economy? That matches the data that shows how disappointing the economy has been. But I think the killer stat actually is, if you were to step back and say, what is the most important measure of how healthy and thriving a society is? Surely it's not money. I would argue it's life expectancy. You want to know other things too, like how healthy people are for the years they're alive. But to me, life expectancy is the most basic measure of a society's health. And the very first chart in my book, there's about one chart per chapter. It's more stories, as you've been noting, than charts. But I do like an occasional chart. And the very first chart in the book has nothing to do with money. It's life expectancy in every rich country around the world for the last several decades. And in 1980, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. It was higher than some countries, it was lower than some other rich countries. That's 1980. It's not that long ago. For the last 15 years or so, the United States has had the lowest life expectancy of any rich country. So that means our life expectancy is lower than every country in Western Europe. It's lower than Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea. It's even lower than some countries that aren't that rich, like China and Chile and Slovenia. And so to me, if this were a situation in which in material or financial ways, we were somehow struggling to make as much progress as we were in the past, but we were otherwise thriving, I would be a lot less worried about it. But I think every measure of human well-being, whether it's financial, whether it's life expectancy, whether it's self-reported happiness, whether it's the number of children growing up with two parents, you name it, whether it's the number of Americans who spent time behind bars at some point in their life, I think by all these measures, the last 40 to 50 years have been, for a large group of Americans, maybe 60% of Americans, maybe 80%, depending how you define it, but for a very large group of Americans, and particularly those who don't have four-year college degrees, it has been an era of stagnation.
I promised that there would be time for questions from the audience. I'm not getting any questions on my phone, and I'm wondering if I'm doing something wrong. Janice, maybe you should text me again. Perhaps. In any case, I'm sure you have them, but they're not appearing here. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have. Here we go. I do have it.
Excellent.
And
I was going to make up some questions if you didn't.
well, I have plenty of questions I want to ask, particularly having read the book. But let me give the audience a chance. Herbert wants to know: the highly educated people who form the base of the Democratic Party, now the thing is jumping around, see mostly this is not very clear.
Well, while you try to clear it up, let me just say a word about.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I'm sorry to
touch
take
on
the
that.
time.
So I think this is a really important idea. There's an economist who I'm sure many people have heard of named Thomas Piketty, a French economist, who's famous for documenting inequality in a big book in his research with Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, two other economists. And Thomas Piketty and some other researchers use this phrase, the Brahmin left, to describe the fact that across much of Europe and the United States, left of center parties have increasingly become the parties of college-educated people. And this is very true in the United States. The Democratic Party's roots, in the modern Democratic Party's roots, were really as a working class party in this country. And FDR really solidified it. He turned it into a multiracial coalition rather than just working class whites. And that was the Democratic Party of the era that we were talking about when the government was making it possible for people to join labor unions and had an antitrust policy that kept companies from getting too big. The Democratic Party has really moved away from those roots and has increasingly become, Thomas Piketty calls it a Brahmin party. I sometimes call it upscale liberalism. And this has a couple of problems. One is, I do think the party is less focused on the interests of working class people than it used to be. I'm not saying the Republican Party is more focused on it. I think the Republican Party is less focused, even less focused on the interest of working class people. But ask yourself, Why is it that labor law reform, making it easier for people to join unions, so a company like Starbucks can't suddenly find reasons to fire all the people who happen to be organizing a union there, or suddenly find reasons to schedule them at horrible hours? This is what companies do when unions try to organize. They basically find ways to get rid of the union organizers. You'd need labor law reform to change that. The Democratic Party keeps saying it's in favor of labor law reform, but never actually does it. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing I would say is that large parts of the left have adopted views on a long list of issues that are pretty anathema to a lot of working class people. And often the Democratic Party will say, well, that's because those people are ignorant or they're hateful. And I think that's unfair. Yes, of course, racism is one reason why the Democratic Party has lost the votes of working class whites over the last 60 years. I want to say that clearly as possible. But I think Democrats often say the only reason someone wouldn't vote for us is because they're racist. And I think that's simply wrong, empirically wrong. It's also a really bad political strategy to say to someone, hey, you're hateful and ignorant, please vote for us. And so whether it's the party suggesting that anything being in favor of border security is racist, which is increasingly not that different from what the Democratic Party position is, whether it's the fact that the party kept schools closed for so long during COVID, whether it's a long list of issues, I think this is why we've seen in the last 5 years a significant shift among not just the white working class. We've seen a significant shift in the last 5 years among the Latino working class, the Asian American working class, and a couple percentage points among the Black working class away from the Democratic Party. And I really think the Democratic Party, rather than just telling people, stop voting against your economic interests, needs to think about how to be more respectful of the social and culturally moderate views that many working class Americans have, and build a bigger tent party that isn't simply a party of college graduates. College graduates still make up a minority of adults in this country. If you want to win elections, it's really hard to do so if you're hemorrhaging support from working class people.
I think that really suggests to the audience how nuanced your book is and how carefully constructed it is. Necessarily, the questions that I'm getting came from the first part of the program.
That's
and
fair.
It's no surprise that this audience is very interested in what's going on in Israel. So let me go back to that for a couple of questions because I do want to give the audience an opportunity. I promised that I would. Lynn wants to know, Politico reported today that Bibi's time, Prime Minister Netanyahu, might be up soon. Do you agree with that? Does the New York Times agree with that? She wants to know.
No, and one of the great things about the New York Times is we do not have uniform views on these questions. I think
glad you said that.
I think it is helpful if people at the New York Times are doing different kinds of reporting and end up having different views. I don't think anyone knows. I think people have pronounced Bibi's political career dead before and been wrong. This is certainly, look, he presides over a government that had a massive security failure and failed at its most basic job, which is to protect its people. The security failures are stunning, as my colleagues at the New York Times documented in a big recent story. But I don't pretend to know whether his time in as prime minister is nearly up or not. And I would even go so far as to say, if you hear someone confidently predicting that, I would be very skeptical. Either way,
he has been able to hold on pretty well. I'm wrong. There are some questions about the economy, and David wants to know how much of the grievance being felt in Middle America, as tapped into by Trump, is a direct result of income inequality caused by trickle-down Reaganomics.
So I just said some critical things about the Democratic Party and its disdain for a lot of working class people.
Give you a chance.
So now I'll say some negative things about the Republican Party. I think the Reagan Revolution really failed to deliver on its promises. I tell the story of the rise of the Reagan Revolution in part through Robert Bork. One of the things that I loved doing in this book is try to take figures who are a little bit familiar to readers, but fill in their stories in ways that I don't think people fully know. People know Robert Bork as a failed Supreme Court nominee. They don't know just how important his ideas were to the formation of Reagan's economic policy. I mean, he and Milton Friedman were really two of the very most important people. Their ideas about what the American economy should look like. And I also tell the story of the Gorsuch family. Ann Gorsuch, a conservative Colorado legislator, is the main person in my book. But many of the audience will recognize the name of her son, Neil Gorsuch, who's of course now in the Supreme Court. If you go back and you look at what the Reaganites promised, they promised that by creating this laissez-faire economy, they would be creating better living standards for every class of Americans. And that just hasn't happened. I mentioned the life expectancy statistics. The 1980s look like a turning point for life expectancy in the United States in a bad way. They're a turning point for income inequality and wealth inequality. They're a turning point in many ways. And it just really wasn't good for most Americans. It was good for a relatively small slice of rich people. And I know that true believers in Reagan's history, and Reagan, to give him credit, he was a true believer. He wasn't just an actor.
I think that's right.
He really believed these ideas. That they had this theory that this will help the economy, which was struggling terribly in the 70s with high oil prices. And it wasn't crazy to have this theory that the economy's problems were so big that they should try something really different. But it didn't work. And the specific promises they made about what the American economy would be like for people after they put in place major deregulation, massive cuts in taxes, a very different approach to antitrust policy, a very different approach to unions and basically trying to eliminate them. They made these specific promises, and those promises have not come true. And I know that Reaganites will sometimes say, yes, but if we had really put in the entire agenda, things would have been much better. I'm very dubious of arguments like that. I mean, Marxists sometimes make arguments like that the problem with the Soviet Union's economy was that it wasn't communist enough. And I'm pretty dubious of that. The United States moved more toward a laissez-faire economy than really any other Western country. And we have, in some ways, worse results. Not in other ways, our results look similar, but it just didn't work. And so I really do think that the economy that we created in the 1980s failed to deliver. And to me, it's another sign that capitalism remains the single best system for delivering rising living standards to people, but only a certain type of capitalism, a capitalism that acknowledges capitalism's problems, the fact that left to its own devices, it tends to lead to increasing inequality, it tends to lead to problems like climate change, and a version of capitalism where the government moderates capitalism to get the best out of it, but not to get an economy like the one we have, which really works a lot better for a small slice of affluent people than it does for most Americans.
Rich wants to know, what do you think the role of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United has had in damaging the American dream?
I think it's a significant role. So we're talking here about campaign finance. And I do think the capture of our political system by relatively wealthy interests.
Goes to power.
Yeah, it does go to power. I just wouldn't, I would ask people, don't think that campaign finance is like a magic bullet, that if only we could change that, everything would be okay. I don't think that's the case. I think that Republicans win elections in part because they often get huge and sometimes anonymous gifts. But Republicans also win elections for the reasons that I mentioned before. A lot of Americans look at the Democratic Party's position on a whole bunch of issues, and they say, that doesn't represent me. And campaign finance reform wouldn't address the fact that many Americans without a four-year college degree look at the Democratic Party and say, that's an elitist party that looks down on my views on a whole set of issues. I mentioned immigration before. I mentioned COVID before. I think crime is another example. I think patriotism and religion are examples. Some of these are not concrete policy issues, but they're real issues. I think energy costs are sometimes an example. And I think that even with campaign finance reform, if the Democratic Party didn't solve those problems, it wouldn't start magically winning all the elections.
David wants to know, has the he calls it misguided tax system destroyed the notion of the common good in the United States?
It's played a role, yes. I mean, I mentioned before, look, during the years when the American economy was doing best, the top marginal tax rate was either 90% or 70%. And I'm not saying that in this interlinked world, we should go back to 90%, but we're below 40%. And so we're a long way from 90%. And look, part of the reason why George Romney, as I mentioned before, returned that bonus is tax rates were so high that he wasn't actually giving up that much money. And so to move to this system where we've cut taxes so much on the wealthy, I really do think has starved our country of resources. Warren, you mentioned what are the factors that have caused us to kind of fall behind. I mentioned corporate culture. I mentioned political power. The third is investment. We just don't invest in the future in the way we used to. That's schools, it's scientific research. I tell this story, and I won't tell it in detail here, but I tell the story in the book that if you want to fly from Los Angeles to New York today, it takes more time than it did 50 years ago. You'll sit in more traffic on the way to the airport. You'll have a longer security line wait at the airport. Amazingly, the scheduled flight time from New York to LA or LA to New York is longer than it was 50 years ago. I mean, that is a damning example of stagnation. It's not the case in many other countries that life has slowed down that much. And some of that comes from the fact that we've cut taxes so much on affluent people that we just don't have the funds that we used to do things like build Eisenhower's interstate highway system and invest in the future in ways that both Republicans and Democrats used to do.
So you've talked about power, you've talked about culture, you've talked about investment. This program is dedicated to the memory of David Lehrer. And he used to say to every guest, and you were one once before, and I'll say it again to you in his absence today, can we end the program with something uplifting and optimistic that'll make everybody feel a little bit better?
So I don't know if David was in my head when I was writing this book. I'm sure on some level he is, but my book is deeply Lehrerist in the following ways, which it is a book in which much of it is about a rise and fall. The first section is still called The Rise, and the second section is still called The Fall. But my conclusion actually includes some arguments about why we should have some optimism. And they go like this. And I want to be very clear. I'm not saying we're guaranteed to escape our problems. I'm deeply worried about climate change. I'm deeply worried about the authoritarian threat in this country. We face real problems. So the question is, in addition to the inequality and stagnant living standards that I document in the book. So the question is, what are we going to do about that? And I think many Americans look at our political system and say that it is hopelessly rigged, that we can't do anything about it. And I would ask them to think about the long sweep of history. In the 1920s and early 30s, labor unions in this country lost essentially every battle that they had fought for decades. I mentioned A. Philip Randolph before, who might be my favorite character in the book, chapter 4. I mean, A. Philip Randolph was facing racism. He was facing incredible hostility to unions. If ever there was someone who had cause to give up on the political system as hopelessly rigged, it was A. Philip Randolph. He grew up in segregated Jacksonville, Florida, but he didn't give up on the system as rigged. Instead, he helped build this grassroots movement that really helped change the country and make our economy less unequal. And you could say, well, that was 100 years ago. It can never happen today. And I would say, don't be so sure about that. The civil rights movement in the 1960s overcame long odds. It changed public opinion. It organized. It changed laws. The women's movement changed public opinion and changed laws. The disability rights movement in the 1970s and beyond changed public opinion and changed the laws. And if we want to go really recent, the marriage equality movement. 20 years ago, I don't think anyone would have predicted that same-sex marriage would become illegal as rapidly as it became legal. We have had movement after movement change this country, often for the better. And the way that it's happened is people have built grassroots movements. They've worked to change public opinion. They've been savvy about it. They haven't been disdainful of most Americans' opinion. They've changed public opinion. They've elected politicians who want to change the law, and they've changed the law. And I'm not predicting this is guaranteed to happen. But to me, the greatest problem we've had in our unequal economy is we have not had a grassroots movement on either the political right or the political left. Often the right is pushing in the wrong direction on this stuff. We have not had a movement on either the right or the left that tries to raise workers' wages across the board, not just the minimum wage, which is another example of a successful movement, by the way, but raise workers' wages across the board. We haven't had a grassroots movement to lower healthcare costs or make it possible for people to afford better schools. And there are tangible ways people could do that. It is possible for Congress to change the law to make it easier for labor unions to form. It is possible to do all kinds of things. And so, to the extent that people are looking for reasons for optimism, I would say the American system has changed this country more profoundly and sometimes more rapidly than seemed likely at the time before. It's done it recently. And I think if we actually had a movement that was dedicated to lifting the living standards of most Americans, including Americans who lack a college degree, I really think we could create that change in the country in the decades ahead. And I think as deep as our problems are, they are not a cause to give up. They're a cause for people to work even harder to make this country live up to its ideals.
David Lehrer would be smiling. I think we're out of time. The book is still called Ours Was a Shining Future. What's the subtitle now?
The Story of the American Dream.
All right. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to talk with you. And let me recommend the book. It is a fascinating read. We have on Tuesday, November 7th, Dennis Ross is going to have a briefing on the crisis in Israel. On Wednesday next week, American historian scholar Ruth Ben-Ghiat will be in conversation with Stanford's political sociologist Larry Diamond. The topic will be strongmen and autocrats today, proliferating or declining. That's going to be good stuff next week. Be sure to tune in, and thank you very much for being with us today. Have a good night and be healthy and safe as time goes on. Thanks a lot.